everyone, and welcome to Shade with me, your host, Lou Mensah. For this episode in Series 11, we'll be launching into a conversation on the life and works of the artist Donald Rodney, coinciding with the opening of Visceral Canker, a survey show of the artist's work at Spike Island in Bristol. Donald Rodney was a British artist whose practice spanned sculpture, installation, drawing and digital media. He was a leading figure in the British Black Art Group of the 1980s. His work dealt with themes of race, injustice, chronic illness and British colonialism. Throughout his life, Rodney suffered from sickle cell disease, the experiences of which he often incorporated in his work as metaphors for societal ills and injustices more broadly. For those who don't know, sickle cell disease is a group of inherited red blood cell disorders that affects hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen throughout the body. Almost 300 babies are born in the UK with sickle cell each year, and I was one of the 1 in 79 babies born in the UK each year that carry sickle cell trait. You can find out more on the disease by visiting the Sickle Cell Society. Okay, and back to the work. This major survey of Rodney's work at Spike Island comprises large-scale oil pastels on X-rays, kinetic sculptures, interactive digital work and restaged installations, along with rare archival materials spanning Rodney's career. Visceral Canker is curated by Robert Leckie, Spike Island's former director, and Nicole Yip, the gallery's new director. And today I'm joined by both Nicole and Robert to discuss the life and works of Donald Rodney, the ambitions of the exhibition, and the complexities around interpreting artists' work once they are no longer with us. Okay, let's get to the conversation. Nicole and Robert, thank you so much for joining me today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here on Shade.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, I'm really looking forward to the show. I'll be visiting in the summer. And for our listeners yet to be acquainted with the work of Donald Rodney, can you offer just a brief introduction and share a little bit about this survey currently showing at Spike Island?
Donald Rodney was an artist born in the early 60s in the West Midlands to parents who had come to the UK from Jamaica in the late 50s as part of the Windrush generation. And he first came to prominence, in the early 80s as part of the Black Art Group when he was still a student at Trent Polytechnic in Nottingham. I think he's one of those artists who, from very early on, seemed to harness like every means of expression at his disposal to serve his creative vision. He had this incredible impulse for innovation, working across many different mediums, from these paintings on X-rays to animatronics and digital media. He experimented also with the most unusual materials, even making sculptures out of his own skin, often going against the advice of those who warned him about their fragility and future complications with conservation, which is something we've come up against in making the show. I guess broadly speaking, his work deals with, complex issues around constructions and representations of race, illness, the body, Black masculinity, and the ongoing pathologies of society, and how all of these things intersect. He suffered from sickle cell anemia throughout his life. So he endured persistent pain and faced increasing periods of hospitalization and immobility. And it's, I think this sort of embodied experience of the body in crisis, no doubt shaped his work. So he, explored the Black body fragmented by pain, illness, and medicalization, but also powerfully used the allegories of disease to explore the wider diseases of society. In the exhibition, what we've tried to do is to be as comprehensive as possible. So to bring together as much as we could that survives of Rodney's work. And we also spent a lot of time in the archives at Tate and also at the estate. So we're showing some really special, rare archive material, some of which has never been shown before. And we've also worked very closely with the estate to recreate an installation which was previously lost.
This is a major survey, and it's set to introduce a new generation of audiences to the artist's life and practice, which is, of course, wonderful. But I'm also wondering, given Rodney's centrality in British art, why this cementing of his role as a vital figure has taken such a long time.
I would say that actually, I don't know if I agree if it has, because I think that there's a lot of work that has gone on over the past several years since Rodney passed away by other art historians, friends, acquaintances that were connected to Rodney and really understood, him and his work throughout his life. And so I think that there maybe has not been an exhibition of this scale, but there have been significant moments. So there was a show called In Retrospect that was presented at Innova back when it was at Rivington Place in 2008, which I think for a particular generation of people, especially those closely connected to Rodney, it was this kind of marking point in time where the work was kind of celebrated and, introduced, no doubt, to a wider public. I think the difference is maybe perhaps more generational, and this really gets to the heart of why we wanted to do this exhibition in the first place. For people of mine and Nicole's generation, we've read about Donald's work in books, or we've seen pictures of it in books or online, and he has this kind of semi-mythical status as an artist whose work was brilliant and compelling, but which we'd never really seen beyond a couple of pieces. And so really the impetus for bringing together the exhibition was like, let's make this an opportunity to actually bring this work together, show it for the first time. And actually, Nicole and I hadn't seen most of it in the flesh until we were installing the show a few weeks ago. I think there really is this kind of like generational difference in terms of what it means to do a Donald Rodney show now. But I think it's really important to understand that there has been a huge amount of work that's gone into conserving Donald's legacy by many people prior to us, significantly people like Diane Simmons, who obviously, together with Keith Piper, is very involved in Donald's estate, Eddie Chambers, Richard Hilton, Virginia Namarco, and others.
I think it's also interesting to think about, the way that the context that exists now for his work to be understood within, and how that's changed over the past sort of 20, 30 years. I feel like there has been a tremendous amount of work. Also, the sort of presentation of some landmark exhibitions, and I think of shows like, Afro Modern at Tate Liverpool, which was 2010, 2011, which was, of course, inspired by Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic. But, the work that those kinds of exhibitions did to set the stage for understanding the hybrid cultures that were created in the afterlives of slavery, and how that sets a kind of lineage or historical context for the work. In our process of research, it was interesting to look back at some of the press that was written about Rodney's work and that of other Black artists in like the 80s and 90s. And so much of it was just really like superficial and reductive and caricatured the work for being angry or preachy or, too racially specific. So, even I guess I think of this kind of trajectory being bookended by shows like Afro Modern and, say, Life Between Islands, which was a couple years ago, both exhibitions at Tate, and the way that discourse has changed in those intervening years, and the increased visibility and profile of, artists of the Windrush generation and the global majority more generally. It also took a long time to make this particular show, didn't it, Robert? And there are lots of logistical reasons as to why that was.
I would absolutely love to hear about that, the inception and how you got to the point where the show was going to happen, and what were the stages that you went to that have taken you to this point.
We started 4 years ago by reaching out to Diane at the estate to just ask about the feasibility of doing an exhibition. And Diane was, very warm and very helpful, but made very clear quite early on that there are certain challenges around putting together an exhibition of this scale of Donald's work, partly because much of the work is in various regional collections throughout the country and national collections, and also partly because a significant amount of it is lost. So there's a really great and important book on Donald's work called Doublethink that was published by Autograph in 2003, and that was edited by Richard Hilton, and it includes really great essays by Eddie Chambers and Virginia DeMarco. In it, there are many, many photographs of work from the archive, which it's kind of unclear whether or not they still exist. And so it's a bit like being presented with a menu where many of the things are no longer available.
Right.
and so we kind of had this ongoing dialogue with Diane about, what's where, what's available, and so much of it has been lost, partly because, when Donald was making it, he didn't have a lot of money. He would move studio and he would leave stuff behind,
yes.
Or he would give bits and pieces to friends. And there just wasn't this understanding of the need to conserve it for posterity. And also maybe we'll talk more about later the fact that, in working with materials like oil paint on X-ray, it's like a conservator's worst nightmare.
Yeah.
And so the conversations with conservators around maintaining and displaying that work have been, difficult, but interesting, but difficult. And so it was through these conversations with Diane that we began to get a grip on basically what still existed and where it was. And then once we had that list, we reached out to the various different collections to ask for permission to borrow work, because many of these collections are council funded, council run. Often they have been under a very difficult circumstances in recent years because of many, many years of austerity. And so they're underfunded and they don't have the resources to be able to conserve the work, or even in some cases have a registrar to be able to tell us whether or not we could borrow it.
Gosh.
And so you end up in this crazy situation where you're really presented with the fragility of these collections themselves, which is interesting given the themes of Donald's work and also all of the hard work that the estate did to place this work in collections so that it could be accessible and available to future generations. So it's been really interesting, depressing and challenging to kind of piece it all together. There was a kind of hiatus where we were just waiting for responses and communicating with the various lenders. And we said to Diane at that point that, we really wanted to do the show, but we just need to figure out very practically, like, is it possible? Like, what state is the work in? Can we get funding to conserve it? Will they let us borrow it? So it's really these kind of simple questions. And always, I think this quite straightforward principle has really guided how we've approached, the show from a curatorial point of view as well, in that we didn't want to bring a very specific kind of curatorial agenda to this work. We really wanted to just bring it together and show it and essentially bring together as much work as we could get our hands on. And we have managed to get hold of pretty much all of it. There was a minor tragedy a few weeks before the exhibition opened, where a really great work, The Land of Milk and Honey 2, which is in the collection of Birmingham Museums and Art Gallery, was opened in the crate in the storage of the museum and was found to be damaged and leaking fetid milk. So that's one key work that we are not able to include, but thankfully by no fault of our own. But that is a really great analogy for the fragility of the estate and the kind of the challenge in general.
I'd like to go back to those kind of identity markers and narratives later. It's really interesting. But I have a personal interest in this work as a Black disabled artist myself. I have a particular interest in Rodney's work and some of the works on display in Visceral Canker that especially stand out to me and I really love include Britannia Hospital 3, which Rodney painted in 1988. And it includes a figure based on Frida Kahlo's painting, The Broken Column, but Rodney's depiction features the face of Cherry Gross, a mother who was shot by police in a raid that prompted the 1985 Brixton riots. All of this is tied up in my own history. I had family involved in those protests at the time. So this is just very pertinent. It's part of my history. I'm just really interested in lots of things that we look at here when we look at the work of someone like Rodney's, especially when we're seeing the delicacy, the fragility. I'm thinking of House of My Father as well from 96, 97, where there's a close-up photographic image of the artist's hand in which sits a small house sculpture made from his own skin. And then there's Psalms as well from 1997. And this work was originally shown at the centrepiece of Rodney's 1997 exhibition, Nine Night in El Dorado at the South London Gallery, and constitutes an autonomous wheelchair. Rodney was too ill to attend his own event. I understand that situation quite closely, but which took place a year before he passed. And the chair is an ex-photo, so it was a stand-in for the artist. These works are just they're so visceral. They're so pertinent, not just to audiences because of the work themselves, but also for the messages and the themes that are going throughout the work. I'm really interested in this sort of 10-year period and these particular works depicting his illnesses and the themes that he's unpicking, how these works sort of punctuate the timeline of his development as an artist. What do we see happening? Where do we see the development? You know, what's going on in terms of Rodney's development here in these works from 88 going through to the year before he passed with this wheelchair piece?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, I think what sort of connects the three works that you've singled out is they each contain an element of self-portraiture. And that's perhaps something that you don't immediately think of when you think of Rodney's work, which, maybe tends to be understood as being more kind of outwardly political. But it's something that is definitely a sort of recurrent preoccupation across many of the works in the exhibition. There's a really nice quote about him talking specifically about his interest in using X-rays. And he described this need to pursue a media that is both rich in its allegory, deliberately visually provocative, but also holds an autobiographical thread throughout.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting in terms of thinking about a trajectory across these three works in this time period is the movement from representations of a more figurative to a more abstracted body. So, the representation of the body becomes more fragmented, even invisible, and certainly less literal. And I feel like as he faced increasing periods of hospitalization and immobility, there's also, I have a sense of this kind of turn towards greater introspection, toward the sort of personal or towards a kind of internal state, which is interesting.
I would just add that there's a work that you haven't mentioned, which is Auto Icon, which I think speaks to what Nicole was just saying, which was envisaged by Donald in the late 90s and then actually finished by a close group of his friends after he passed in the early 2000s. And this is a kind of digital artwork, originally CD-ROM, but envisaged at the beginning as something that would scrape images, audio, video content from the internet, and through which you can kind of interact with Donald. So you sit at a keyboard and you type prompts into Auto Icon, and then Donald will respond with kind of like snippets of his own voice or audio and video clips that are kind of contained within the work, but kind of originally was imagined to be something more expansive that would kind of freely scrape from the internet. And so I think this is kind of, it speaks to this additional kind of dissolving, I guess, of the body that Nicole is talking about, an expansion towards the idea of, like, I guess, an awareness of his own, mortality and vulnerability, but also in the ways in which he can kind of get past that and supersede it through this work, where essentially he kind of remains present, and through which you can continue to interact with him.
It's so touching, actually, this visibility when one is starting to feel invisible. I just think it's such a touching indication of what was going on and how he was expressing what was happening for him. And I've been thinking especially about the way that art is interpreted after an artist's death, especially when the artist is perhaps Black or disabled. Often the the narrative surrounding the work can hone in on our obvious identity markers. You know, I have those markers myself. But I'd love to ask, in what ways, when putting together a show such as this one, do we navigate our assumptions, perhaps, and interpretations around the artist's racial and physical identity? Nicole, you were talking to that earlier about, you know, the newspaper extracts from the 80s, you know, obviously did this. They put these narratives onto his work. And we do that less so now. We have more of an understanding. There's more open conversations. Communities have opened up more. But I just think it's really interesting how, when you're creating a show like this, you're able to navigate assumptions and interpretations about an artist, even when we're getting information from family and friends. It's still not coming from the artist, but how we try to avoid the reduction of who they are and just make sure that we include all of that rich complexity and truth into the exhibition narrative.
I think this is a wonderful, complex question, so thank you for asking it. And I've got lots of different thoughts around it. I think first, this point that we kind of mentioned earlier, which is trying to make sure that in putting together the exhibition, we really focus in on Rodney's engagement with materials and technology and how this shifted throughout his life. And so how, as an artist, he kind of had this seemingly unstoppable hunger for trying new things out, often with the support of a group of kind of friends or individuals that had specific knowledge in a particular area. So someone like Mike Phillips, who was very involved in the development of Psalms or Auto Icon, for example. But then I also think that there's this sense that Rodney was always trying to use his kind of experience as a Black male to talk about the kind of broader issues that were affecting society. So this is where the kind of visceral canker of the title of the show originates from. And there's this great text that I've mentioned before by Eddie Chambers in the Doublethink book, where he is talking precisely about how, even though there are these elements of kind of self-portraiture and Donald is very present in the work, even when he's absent, there's always this sense that he was always talking about broader societal ills that go beyond his own personal experience, even though his personal experience might be representative of those ills.
Yeah.
And then I think that it's interesting that you say that you feel like there has been a significant shift in terms of the interpretation of work by Black artists in the 80s and 90s and, you know, more recently, because you can see how it has changed significantly, specifically when we read the articles that Nicole referred to, which tend to be more productive. But I do think that there is still a tendency to over-identify artists with their identity and really use that as a tunnel through which to kind of read or interpret or kind of confine interpretations of their work. And I think this does still persist. And I think that we need to be very, very careful in how we navigate this. And I'm not saying we've done it perfectly, but we thought a lot about, for example, the fact that Donald was very closely connected in the kind of popular imagination to the origins of the Black Art Group. And of course, meeting these people and being around these conversations was really central to his formation as an artist. He talks about the fact that basically before meeting Keith Piper at Nottingham Trent, he was basically painting flowers. And so he talks about his work getting much more kind of quote unquote blacker and much more politically engaged through these discussions with Keith and then eventually Eddie and others. And so you kind of have this sense that whilst that was central, it wasn't everything.
Yes.
And there was so much more that he was thinking about. And again, I'd bring it back to works like Auto Icon or indeed Psalms, which you mentioned, where this like engagement with new technologies, you know, way before other artists were really thinking seriously about this stuff, is so present.
Yes.
You know, to think about like an internet artwork in the late 90s with the kind of sophistication and complexity that Donald was thinking about it is really astounding to me. And it just makes me think like, what a shame and how sad it is that he wasn't around for longer to kind of continue like this really like hungry, like frantic, excitable engagement with his different ideas and materials. And then the final thing I would say is that the other thing that people have said also about Donald, which is also difficult having not known him personally, is that he was really funny, and that he was like such a warm figure who would like really light up a room, even from his hospital bed when he was like undergoing very difficult health situation and circumstances. This is really wonderful to hear, that he maintained this kind of energy and enthusiasm, generosity of spirit, which, yeah, of course, unfortunately, we were not able to witness, but really kind of comes through in the recollections that people have around him and his work, which go beyond these kind of identifiers of like race and identity that might tend to close down a reading of a person.
Thank you. I think that was a beautiful way to end the conversation, and thank you both so much for speaking with me today. I know you're both very busy.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, it's Lou, just hopping on to thank you for listening to this conversation with Nicole and Robert. I found it so interesting to think about the work of Donald Rodney and its continued resonance and the depth of considerations that have to go into the curation of this work. Visceral Canker is on at Spike Island until Sunday, the 8th of September of this year, before it moves to its iteration at Nottingham Contemporary, and it will end its run at the Whitechapel Gallery. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Subscribe to Shade Podcast and listen to all the episodes in this series. Also explore Shade Art Review on Substack, joining the art-curious listeners like you receiving art listings, comment, artist spotlight features and guest writing. Sign up today to receive your 20% off the annual membership. This series was produced and hosted by me, Lou Mensah. It was mixed by Maylee Evans, and the music was composed for Shade Podcast by Brian Jackson. I'll see you next time.